Welcome to the panel discussion on making instant cross-border payments a reality for the future. Let me just start off by saying that even though we are doing online shops across borders, we are doing purchases with our credit cards instantly today. When it comes to the notion of direct debit transfer, we have a bit far to go when it comes to having instant transactions. So in this panel today, we will discuss the topic, where we are today, what the challenges are, and what we think of are the plans to head. My name is Stig Johansson. I have a broad background from payment services, both from the public side and from the private side. And with me here today, I have an esteemed panel. I have Ann from Riksbanken, I have Martin from P27, and I have Saskia from Swift. So I will start by handing to each and every one of you to introduce yourselves. So let's start with Ann.
Thanks a lot, Stig. Thanks a lot. Well, I was introduced at the previous session, but I might just mention that I'm involved in two very interesting projects at the Riksbank. I am leading a pre-study about our future RTGS system, and I am also involved in the analysis we are doing together with the ECB on a potential cross-currency instant solution based on TIPS, which I also briefly touched upon in the previous session. Also, in my previous role at the European Central Bank, I was intensely involved in the SEPA project and also in EU payment legislation. Instant payments on a cross-border level is certainly an interesting subject. Instant is more and more becoming part of our daily lives, especially here in Sweden, where Swish is broadly used for both P2P and P2B business. And we are not only, as Stig also said, we are not only traveling cross-border, but also shopping and working, which means that an increasing number of cross-border payments. And therefore, I think that the demand for instant cross-border will follow the widespread use of instant on national level. Thanks.
Thank you, Ann. Let's go to Martin from P27.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for having me here. So I'm coming from P27. I have been following and working with this project pretty much 3 years now. In the first period from one of the bigger Nordic banks, and then I had the opportunity to jump over to the company and work there. My role in the company is to be responsible for the business execution unit, so I'm a little bit all over the company, you can say. And P27 as a company, why do we exist? We are obviously kind of a wish from the 6 biggest Nordics banks to kind of take a grip on the way we pay in the Nordics. The Nordic banks, they are Nordic as such, the biggest ones, working in all of the Nordic countries, and also, of course, create an efficiency and a smooth and a stable system for them that is based on a joint infrastructure. That is, of course, something that has been a wish for a really long time. But now we can say that the technique is actually there, so it is possible to do something like P27, and it's all about creating one platform that will cover all of the Nordic countries. Where we will be able to pay both domestically and also across the borders. We are quite far in the project. We've been working quite hard during these years. We have been building the company, building the model. During 2020, we actually grew from 11 people till now we are a bit more than 40. We are having people in all of the Nordic cities except for Norway, which we are approaching a little bit differently, and we are proceeding according to plan, we can say, to try to bring out the solutions for account-to-account payments in the Nordics.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin. And last but not least, we go to Saskia from Swift.
Thank you, Stig, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, Swift, I think I would say we were one of the first fintechs. Banks at that time were still doing cross-border payments using a telex machine. And so they asked us to innovate and to bring that into a much more automated way. Between then, more than 40 years ago, and today, also we have changed a lot. We have 11,000 members. We work with market infrastructures all over the world. We work with central banks like Riksbank, and we work with P27 and many others around the world, with indeed the objective to look at more wholesale cross-border payments. We are less used in the domestic areas. We have evolved over time. We just don't do any more enhancing cross-border payments. We also offer a lot of value-added services, and I think during the panel we'll probably come to those, like compliance, sanction screening, data, all of that becoming more and more important. Nevertheless, SWIFT remains a cooperative, and we also changed our strategy with exactly, I would say, the same title as this panel. We are building for next year a new platform with indeed the vision of delivering instant frictionless payments on a cross-border level. So I think this fits with this panel very well.
Perfect. I do think that the mixture of just sort of P27 coming from the sort of more Nordic new innovation perspective, we have the world's oldest central bank represented here, also doing cutting edge innovation, and together with SWIFT, sort of maybe the first and sort of fintech, if I read you right, on the global cross-border payment scale. If we try to sort of get some perspective on this, we all know that there is a lot of focus coming from the G20 on cross-border payments. From your perspective, both sort of personally and from your organization's perspective, what are the problems today, both sort of in the Nordics, where we are of course most familiar, but also in EU and global when it comes to cross-border payments? Let me start with you, Martin, from P27.
Yeah, I think actually that Anne said a couple of things in her introduction as well, and I can echo many of those ones. The big issue right now is the complexity. And when I think complexity, I don't really think about the bigger corporates. They're having a good and developed treasury. They have been doing SWIFT payments for many, many years. They're having cash pools in between the countries, and they can maneuver and take care of that. But for a little bit smaller companies and also private persons, we're talking about a totally different situation, and that is where we expect quite a lot of growth to become, and also e-commerce and many other things around it. So when we take it down to the retail, then we have a totally different starting point, and there we have the issues on complexity, on efficiency, on transparency, and on cost, and all of the other things that we talk about when we talk about issues around cross-border payments. And that is the place where we need to think, how can we make this better? How can we create the reach? How can we make it simple? How can we get there and also make sure that the space for account-to-account payments develops in the way it shall?
Would you say, just sort of a quick follow-up on your motto, would you say that you mentioned that big corporates, they sort of have liquidity providers and these things in place, that is more sort of a consumer issue?
Consumer and a little bit smaller companies, that is where the big problem is for cross-border payments today. Yeah.
So coming back to sort of SWIFT, what's your view on this? What is the biggest challenges of cross-border payments today?
Well, first of all, I want to echo Martin. I think you're very right that if you know, SWIFT has developed about 4 years ago a system called GPI, where we can actually, the most important is that we can track and trace how cross-border wholesale transactions, I'll come back to you, Martin, on the SMC, but indeed, where we can track and trace, and if I can share a few numbers with you, 92% of those wholesale cross-border transactions are executed within 24 hours. 38% of those are done in 30 minutes. That's not bad, but we can do better. But the benefit of the system in the last couple of years is that we can track and trace what are actually the issues in order to make them even faster. And the first one I would say is currency controls. They exist still in a number of countries. I think the last countries in Europe that abandoned them were Greece and Iceland, I believe. But so other countries outside of Europe, some of them still have currency controls. And of course, they hamper the speed of transactions. And if we take those countries that have currency control out, we see that already we get to 50% of the execution of wholesale cross-border payments being executed in less than 30 minutes. The other issue is, of course, the ability to process. What is the legacy systems, the modernization of the payment systems, the opening hours, how many hours per day can they process? Taking those into place, if we look at much more modern banks, then we already go to 72% of them being executed into 30 minutes. So, and then we have also the difference between, or one of the big different elements between domestic and cross-border is the whole compliance suite. There is much more screening required in cross-border payments. So that comes on top, and I'll come back to that later on in the conversation. But coming back to Martin, which I found a very fair point, Martin, is the SMC in the retail. And also there, we try to look at market practices to actually make, especially for this SME segment and some bigger consumer payments, not the very small little payments in e-commerce, but the bigger consumer executed payments, to indeed, through Swift low value payments, to offer based on the same experience we have with GPI and the fact that we get closer to faster payments, is also use that framework with a different market practice to actually indeed enhance for the future the payments for that specific market segment.
Just a sort of quick follow-up question to you, especially you mentioned sort of the statistic for GPI transfers, and many of them are done within 24 hours, and many also within 30 minutes.
Yes.
How does that map sort of to the whole sort of consumer retail side? Sort of how much of them will actually be able to benefit? I'm sort of thinking, if I were to transfer money to my friend in the US, I guess that it will still take days in reality for me as a consumer to be able to effectuate that, or do we see change there?
Yeah, we see change there. Yeah, first of all, I think we can prove now, due to the tracking system that we built, that actually even high value doesn't take days. Yeah, most of them, 92%, executed at least in 24 hours, and many even much faster. And secondly, for consumer, where the amount is below $10,000, we're looking really at making a market practice where the banks go much faster. Nevertheless, they remain in some countries, as I mentioned, opening hours, processing capability, and of course currency control, which of course is a limited number of countries. That still remains. That is something which neither SWIFT, maybe our community, but even there, I believe the banks cannot solve that. That is another element to be solved. But through a market practice, we see that we can really get them done, in a couple of hours, even already today. And I think with technology, with the enhancements by the banks, and we'll come to that, I think the use of ISO 20022 and platforms, that will make it possible to even reduce that much more in the next few years.
Interesting, thank you. Finally, Anne, what's your view on the sort of challenges we have today? What are the pain points that you would like to highlight?
Well, I think I don't have so much to add. I think most have already been mentioned by Saskia and Martin. But just one remark, cross-border payments within the Eurozone is today flowing rather seamlessly thanks to SEPA. But as soon as you have more than one currency involved, then of course there are area for improvements. But looking at some of the obstacles, there are, of course, and that was already touched upon, the AML rules, which are implemented slightly different among countries. This is causing problems. You also have national specificities and national preferences. There are diverging interpretation of rules and standards. There is, of course, still a lack of harmonization. We need further standardization. So there is, there is still work to do, but I think that it is also being addressed.
Let me just sort of, if I were to sort of follow up on that and sort of what do you think that Riksbank's role and responsibility is? And I'll ask the same to the rest of you, but let's start with you, on sort of how do you see your responsibility to sort of change the future when it comes to this? What role will Riksbanken take?
Well, our mandate is from the Riksdag, and our mandate is to promote safe and efficient payment mechanisms. So Sweden is, of course, our main focus, but we are also part of the EU and closely related with the other European central banks. And we are also involved on a more international context. We are today active in the context of the FSB CPMI work on addressing key challenges faced by cross-border payments. This was initiated by the G20, where they are trying to address these high costs, low speed, limited access, insufficient transparency, and other problems which is hindering the smooth functioning of cross-border payments. I would also like to say that our agreement with the Euro system on access to tips is also bringing us closer to the Euro area. And I think that would also be a good basis for the development of new and innovative payment services, for example, cross-currency instant.
Okay, thank you. Sakya, Anne mentioned the G20 initiatives. There's a lot of work being done in FSB, also in the CPMI. When it comes to you as sort of a more sort of slightly more on the private sector side, what's your responsibility to enhance cross-border payments for maybe for Swedish citizens, but also for other countries and maybe more across, sort of outside EU?
Well, first of all, I want to say that we are a cooperative. It's a community that works together, yeah? And so we work with and the banks and the market infrastructures, everybody all together. And that has a big advantage. I think that when we come to an agreement, there's a faster adoption of what everybody has agreed on. And I think we do that all together. And I think that is important. And even with some industry bodies, indeed, we work together to find a solution for the problems that are there. Secondly, we are trying, one of the elements, I think, in a typical high-value cross-border transaction is that banks are in sequence executing payments. You don't get from, if I may take from Riksbank in Sweden into the US or a certain country in Asia just immediately. There have to be agreements in place. Therefore, we see that these transactions happen in sequence. What we together with the community believe is in order to speed up those transactions, and Anne referred already to it, is standardization, move to ISO 20022 as a new standard because there's much more data in there, but also much more structured data in there. And structure of data and more data allows for compliance to happen faster. But also, if we could do that on a platform, meaning that it's no longer sequenced, but everybody can access that data out of the transaction immediately, even if there are 2, 3, 4 parties involved in the transaction, for it to be executed, that we can speed up the use of that transaction. And I think that's what our community believes. And so making sure that all screening and compliance activities can happen at the same time. And to Anne's point, we also hope that the banks, market infrastructure, central banks, everybody can help us on working together with the regulators to come also there to some more standardization and potentially even a mutualization, trusting that one screens and everybody accepts the screening or do screening in one single way instead of every bank at the same time when it sends and receives transactions to screen. So on that space, we're still working together also with, for example, the ECB on that. And I think the migration, which everybody, especially Europe, I think everybody altogether taking a lead in the world on ISO 20022 will hopefully show the way, not only for Europe, but towards the rest of the world, that we can speed up those transactions with more data, with easier access to compliance services, and therefore speed up these transactions.
So standardization is key, I take it, to be able to move faster ahead.
Yes.
Finally, going on to Martin, on that note, sort of standardization, ISO 2022, it's sort of fairly obvious that P27 has a role in the Nordic, of course. But how would you explain it? Sort of what will you bring to the Nordic payment market when it comes to cross-border payments?
Yeah, there are a couple of things to bear in mind here. One of them is the schemes, the rule books as such, and just as we have been discussing, one of the big obstacles to create a market where money can flow back and forth in seconds. We're talking about real time and cross-border pretty much at the same time, is that we need to align our rule books. In the Nordics, we didn't have the SEPA moment as we did in the rest of Europe, creating the foundation for creating a payments region. A part of the P27 project, when it was a project, was actually to establish a company that will create new rule books based on the EU rule books, the SEPA rule books, with the same standards, but adjusting them for different currencies and different things that are special for the Nordic countries that needs to be taken into account. But if we look at them, they are pretty much the same thing, right? So that is one thing that will solve and create the possibility for us to do payments across borders between the countries and harmonize it and make it strict and clear. The other is, of course, the ISO standard that we now will bring out at the same time. And the third one is that the system that we will bring to the market will not feel any difference in between domestic payments and cross-border payments. So you can... the banks connecting to us, they will need to do settlement, of course, with all of the central banks where they are connected, just as always. But the transaction as such can go from one country to another and then being settled in the right place at the right central bank applicable for that particular currency. So many of the things we are talking about here will be solved by a solution of this kind.
So if I understood it correctly, and speaking from somebody that has spent years as a developer, scratching my head when it comes to different payment formats, you mean that from a technical perspective, you will have sort of unified format, same payment sort of messaging standards, regardless of whether my payment is going to a company in Sweden or to a company in, let's say, Denmark?
Correct. So it will be one participation agreement covering everybody. It will be one setup. It will be one platform. It will be one ISO standard for all of the countries connecting and banks connecting to the platform. So it will take away quite a lot of the noise that is already there and changing quite a lot. But that means, of course, that you need to have the whole community behind you to do something like that. So I can say that when looking at all the stakeholders we work with when developing something like this, it is really, really a lot of people. And we have regulators from all of the countries that are not fully aligned. We have banks with a little bit different starting points if they are interested in cross-border payments or domestic payments and all of that. So we are really working with trying to take something out that is good for everybody. And the setup we will bring to the market will actually take stock on that. So we are saying that, okay, there is actually no difference in between bigger banks and smaller banks. It will be the same terms and conditions for a small bank as it is for a big bank. That does not apply for all of the Nordic countries today. So the barriers to entry will be taken down quite a lot for the smaller banks from that perspective. And it will also create a level playing field in between the countries with the same setup, and also P27 being a cost plus company that we take up. It's a wish from the banks to do this, you can say.
Yeah, and this being Stockholm FinTech Week, I think that there are a lot of challenger banks and smaller banks that would carry on in lowering the entry barriers for different parts of the payments infrastructure. What about sort of use case scenarios? Are there really a need for instant payment? Because a lot of us, especially when you talk to millennials, they expect everything to be instant. But is there really a need? What kind of use cases are we seeing? When do we need instant payments in reality? Any thoughts on that? If I ask you, Saskia, first.
Well, I think we need to definitely split in consumer payments and wholesale payments. And in consumer payments, I would say on average about 97 to 98%, depending a little bit on the country, are domestic instant payments. And I think in a lot, at least in Europe, maybe not everywhere around the world, but in a lot of markets, there is an instant payment system available on the domestic level. So I think that is in a lot of countries already covered. Then the big question comes about cross-border. And actually, we tested 2 years ago, not even 2 years ago, we tested, for example, connecting instant payment systems to each other. So we had the instant payment system in Singapore sending a transaction actually to Europe. It ended up in Germany, and then it went through TIPS, the European system, into Spain, and all of that happened in like 41 seconds. That was a pilot, so we assumed that once we would automate that, that could even go faster. So we continue with the ECB and the banks in Europe to continue to work on that, to interconnect. We already have access since a couple of weeks to faster payments, where we have a number of banks that actually give us access to the system in the UK. We have access to the system in India. We have access to the system in Australia as we developed it there. So more and more we're looking at accessing and building the bridge for consumers between the different domestic systems, because a limited number of their transactions are really cross-border. If I take Europe as a domestic market, for example, you know, the level going outside of Europe is quite limited. So that is, I think, for the consumer space. On the wholesale payments, it depends, I think, on what you mean with instant. I'm questioning a little bit whether corporates expect every of their transactions on the wholesale level being executed in seconds or milliseconds. Yes, do they want them to be executed fast? Absolutely, we agree with that. And I think two more elements that they want is they want to have transparency on costs, because there's cross-border, so there's a fixed currency exchange involved. So I think they prefer more to have visibility on the costs and knowing exactly where the transaction is and when it will be executed, and more importantly, even know if there would be a reason why that transaction could not be executed. Going back to the previous mentioning of currency control taking time, or AML or other sanctions-related items to be executed, that they know when the payment is going to be executed, in overall to have, of course, more close to instant payments, but maybe not in milliseconds, like for the consumer space, I think is required.
As always, when we talk about fun subjects, time flies. So we're pushing close to our 30 minutes here. But I still want to touch on with the same question with sort of P27 and Riksbank. So go with you, Martin, first. What kind of use cases do you see for instant payments, and when is it not applicable?
For instant payment, I think there are a couple of different angles, and we did actually an exercise on this when we started up P27, looking into, okay, can everything move from batch to instant? And we discussed as well how big need of that is to take it out cross-border as well. I think the first answer, if everything can move from batch to instant, the answer on that one is no. There is quite a lot of use cases where the need is not there. There is quite a lot of use cases as well where it actually doesn't make sense to do it as an instant payment, because if we would build an instant system like that, then many corporates would probably put a clock when they do send the payments anyway, like salaries and many other things, because they want to send it in a certain way. We have certain standards that we pay our bill once a month, and it's not that we're sitting and coding it in at the same time and all that. So that will require quite a lot of changes in society. But having said that, thinking about trade, and for instance, Nordic trade, which is something that obviously is very close to my heart in P27, 25% of all the cross-border trade from the Nordic countries is actually staying in the Nordics. So by solving that, you really solve quite a big part of all of these different things when looking at how we shall help our corporates and private persons to blossom and prosper and all of that. And I think that is something that is important to bear in mind. And if we can make that simpler and more efficient in the same way as we pay domestically, then I think we have come extremely far.
And Anne from Riksbanken, what do you see use cases for instant cross-border payments?
Well, I see, of course, what we have today with Swish is, for example, P2P, which I think might also be a use case for cross-border, but it is, of course, as already mentioned by Saskia and Martin, there are broader use cases. So I would see that company would also have the benefits of it, SMEs. There are, as already also mentioned by Martin, I don't think that all payments would be aimed for instant cross-border. For example, batch payments still have the benefits, and I don't think that there is a need for them to be made instantly. But there are certainly, I think, a broader market than what we are currently seeing, and a broader beyond also the P2P. And I would also think that with the increasing competition in payments we are today having from the international payment providers, it would be good also that we are developing a European payment solution, which is competitive and forward-looking and under European governance. And I think that it's something which we should consider and would be to the benefit of Europe.
Just a quick final question to the three of you. Let's say that we're sitting here 5 years from now. It's Stockholm FinTech Week 2026, and I have the pleasure of having three of you on the same panel. What kind of services do you think we have then up and running? Starting with Martin, what do you think we'll have then operating in society?
From our point of view, I cannot resist saying that, of course, then we have a region in the Nordics where there is no difference if you pay domestically or cross-border, and the customer actually can choose in between making instant or batch payments in a very simple way. And then on top of that, we have a different way to pay our bills, a bill payment system that is based on more of a similar solution to request to pay, where the payee and the payer have a good control, all of them in an efficient way, and also a very stable system with good transparency that will enhance a lot. The third thing I would like to bring to the table is a good way for the banks to monitor transactions. By clustering everything together and build a region like that, we will be able to have a system where we can do transaction monitoring in a totally different way than today.
Thank you. What about Swift? Saskia, what do you see in 5 years?
Well, in 5 years, I think looking at the effort of the community being, the banks, the market infrastructures, the central banks, some of the providers, the new things, which unfortunately we didn't bring to the table, but the view on CBDC, all of that, I think we will be in a different world, even in 2025 related to payments. I think there will be much more faster overall, whether it's then 100% instant or some of them not required, but it will be simpler. I also think that for consumers, the world is potentially moving to having, I would say, invisible payments executed. What I mean is that the payment will be so much embedded in what we do every day. When we buy something today, sometimes we really need to say, now I need to, at the end, do the payment, and therefore I need to do this and this and this activity. I think due to the modern technology, it will be so easy to do at the end the payment that it will be just a part of the purchase process and no longer really as something separately. So maybe it might be more difficult to have a conversation by 2025 on payments exactly, because it's going to be part of something a bit broader than just a payment.
And finally, Anne, and I mean, I need to also ask the questions that everybody's thinking, sort of towards you personally. Do you think we'll have an e-krona in 5 years? And what change will we have in society?
I think that what we will have in 2025, we will have smoother, faster, and more efficient cross-border payments within the EU, but also on an international level. Riksinst is up and running from May 2022. The Nordic area harmonized by P27. And we might also have a cross-currency instant settlement solution in place. And it is 4 years. I hope also that we have an e-krona in place and maybe also some other CBDC in place beyond Sweden. This is, of course, only the infrastructures. And on top of that, we also need to have convenient, reliable, and cost-efficient end-user solutions to be developed to ensure that we have a broad take-up and usage. And I really hope that the banks would take this up. And I know that they are already working on it. So what we would need to have in that aspect is a request to pay, which was already mentioned by Martin, instant at point of sale, and also a lot of other supporting services to really bring this as efficient cross-border payments. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. With that, I do anticipate a lot of exciting things happening in the years ahead. For those in the audience, I know that there are a few from policy perspective and also from the regulator taking place. Do take note of the standardization need. And with that, I hope that Martin is right, that the old Gyro card will be gone by 2026. I would like to thank my panelists. You have been brilliant, each and every one of you. And with that, I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
Steve.
Thank you.